and I trust in, and I'm not deliver this message. We got something special coming for the community. The American Indigenous Street and Music Festival in Atlanta in ATL 2025, June 2025. Support this. We need the community. We need our people who acknowledge that they are the real American Indigenous people to support this community event, the American Indigenous Street and Music Festival 2025 in Atlanta, June 2025. Be there, be square. We'll always be square, stand on your square, but be there and show your support. Donate to the American Indigenous Street and Music Festival, June 2025 in Atlanta. This is for the community. This is for us. I want y'all to, everybody, I've been pondering this question, and I want everybody to think on this, because this is a thinking moment. And through thinking moments are teachable moments. You know, in other words, if we allow ourselves to think about things, then we will learn things. We will learn the real truth. So let these questions I pose and the logical answers I give you a direction toward a higher truth, a real truth, the real truth, not a truth, the truth. Because see, you have to say that, because people will, if you say a truth, it makes it seem like there are other truths. But if you say the truth, that means it is the absolute truth. The higher up you go in your level of thinking, the closer you get to the truth. So let me go ahead and begin this. Right. First and foremost, black. Right. I wanted to ask this question: are Black Americans really descended from Africans? Are Black Americans really descended from Africans? I know we hear this thing about the African slave trade and, how we somehow are genetically connected to a lot Africans, so-called the Africans who were brought into America. I know we're connected to that history. Excuse me. Let me rephrase. I know that history, aka U.S. history, claims that we are connected to Africans through a slave trade, right? That we so-called Black Americans are the descendants of African slaves that were brought into America. Now, there's a lot of problems with that. There's a lot of problems with that assertion that's being made, that has been made since the alteration of history. You can look at the timeline from when so-called Black Americans were called Indians, which people still not looking at. This is the U.S. government. This is the slaveholders, or so-called slaveholders. These are the people who tried to determine or tried to classify or classified us as Indian. In the beginning, we were classified as Indians. So if in the beginning we were classified as Indians, not Africans, why now, 150 to 200 years later, we're being called African Americans? Who pushed us in that direction of Africa when at one point in time there was no connection? It was understood that the so-called slave trade here in America was built on the back of American indigenous people. Africa had nothing to do with it. Africa or so-called African slaves had nothing to do with it. I want y'all to think about this for a second. Remember, I asked the question, what good would African slaves have done in America? What good would African slaves be, or what good would they have done in America? All right. Here you talking about a people who are totally foreign to the soil, right? And I got to ask this question. How did the so-called Europeans know or think that the Africans would be good slaves to come and work? Why would they think that? Why would they think a total foreign people? What would make them think, let's just go over here to this continent and get these people who are, as they say, primitive, who don't know the language, who can't come over here and farm the soil because they don't know the land? What would make them think, hey, let's go over to Africa and get people who, are foreign? Here it is. They're foreign already. The Caucasians, the Europeans, the so-called white people who became white people. right? Classified as white people. What made them think, hey, let's go and get people from a whole nother continent to come here and work? What made them think that? Did that even make sense? And have them come over here to pick cotton. You're going to go get a group of foreigners to come and pick cotton. That's all, because that's all they claim we did here. Black Americans, all we did was pick cotton, right? And you're going to go all the way over across the Atlantic Ocean to go get people to come back and pick cotton. Did that even make sense? Right? You're going to risk your life and the lives of people who are going on these boats, who are going to continue to go on ships to bring these so-called Africans here, right? You got to fight with these people. You know, you're not talking about children here. You're talking about grown men and grown women that you have to bring back and you have to fight with. And, you know, just for them to pick cotton, it doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. I don't care what history says. History lies all the time. People make up history all the time. The U.S. history is totally made up. We can point back to the fact that Black Americans was once referred to in this country as Indian, right? They were referred to as Indian. If you go back in a lot of our older birth records, you'll see Indian. And I'm talking about not, you know, even up until the civil rights movement, the term Indian was still being used in certain cases, right? So wouldn't it make more sense to enslave the indigenous people? I just want y'all to think, wouldn't it make more sense to enslave indigenous people, people who already doing the things that, you know, you need to get done, people that understand the language? Because our people obviously understood, Black Americans obviously understood the language because they were trading with the Europeans. They learned the language or English, or had American English, which came to be a trading language, right? That was developed here in America from the indigenous people and the English. That's where the American English come from. That's why you got an American English dictionary. You got American English. American English is an amalgamation of words from the American Indians or indigenous people, us, and the European English, you know, Caucasians. That's where modern day English comes from. That's why if you listen to the English in England and you listen to American English, there's differences. Those differences came from the American indigenous people, us. You see, so-called Black Americans have a very rich history here in America, you know. But if you go back, the term Black and Negro and all this other stuff starts to disappear, and then you start to see Indians. You start to see the indigenous people here, the Indians, right? Who are the descendants of the Mayans, right? The Mesoamericans who made their way over into North America. That's our direction, our path into North America. The people who were the first inhabitants of North America were your Mesoamericans, your Mayans and Aztecs. These are because you had South and Central America that was being occupied, right? Mexico and all those other places, but people didn't come all the way to North America like that for 1,000 years. Then our people started making their way further into the Americas as North America. And that's your Mayans, your Aztec, who eventually broke up into different tribes and spread all out. Then we got your Cherokee. I'm talking about millions of people making their way over into the Americas, right? Building villages, farming the land, being the original people of North America, the Mesoamericans, which is where Black Americans really descend from. You see, history, you know, U.S. history doesn't want to talk about too much about American history. Now, I said there's a difference between American history and U.S. history. U.S. history is the time in which Europeans started recording their entrance into America. They started recording it, and that's where U.S. history starts, right? Where they start recording their entrance into America. They really don't go back too far, but, you know, or more or less where the United States became an independent nation from Britain. That's where U.S. history starts, right? Prior to that time, American history and all that wasn't really recorded by Caucasians coming over here being American. They didn't really record history like that. It was more the English recording that. When Europeans were coming over here as English, they were recording the history more in their encounters with the indigenous people, which they describe as bronze people, so-called Black Americans. They describe their encounters with the indigenous people, so-called Black Americans. You see, and they have these accounts out here. They're not really describing the Mongolian people. They're describing bronze people. Now, there's mixtures of Asian and indigenous meaning, or Indian Americans, us, the Asian and American mix, which is why you see a lot of dark-skinned people with straight hair. You see a lot of dark-skinned people with very straight hair, with slanted eyes and whatnot. And that bronze skin, that is the American indigenous people. You see? And a lot of those people being the original people, because, again, people think the original Indians look like these Indians today. This is why it's hard to get it, to get our people to fathom that we are the American Indians and that we're not African, because we've had the image of Indians programmed in us to be these Mongolian people, you see, and we had the image of African put in us, to be connected to those people. But you can clearly see the cultures is different. They'll sit up here and say, oh, we don't have our African culture because we was forced to follow European culture. Well, that don't mean nothing. That's not true. That's not true at all, because, again, I'll point to people like Tariq Nasheed. I got to, because his theory, is that Black Africans came over into America through slavery and mixed in with the American indigenous people, meaning us over here, and that's what became the ethnogenesis. So he's basically saying we're African and American, because the American and indigenous parts, we are the only real Americans. But if you're saying we have an African influence, which we do not, because that's the only, the issue I have with people saying that there is no African influence at all. The African influence is not going to disappear. It's going to be carried in some way, shape, or form. That whole African influence, where that comes from? That comes from people like Alex Haley, right? Where Alex Haley had to make an African connection. What do I mean by that? In the movie Roots, people don't know that the character of Kunta Kinte in the movie Roots, right, was added from another person's, a Caucasian man's book named Harold Corlander, who sued Alex Haley in court for copying and plagiarizing the character of Kunta Kinte and the whole African connection from his book to Alex Haley's book. Alex Haley plagiarized that. You see, this is really where we get the whole African connection nonsense at. This is really where we get that from. This whole lie that we came over here from Africa on slave ships. I told y'all got to be very careful of people who tell that story. You got to be very careful. I even had to start looking at the Nation of Islam kind of side eye. I'm going to be honest with you. Because, when Elijah Muhammad, when it was around, they still had a lot of knowledge, through... You see, this is what I'm saying. Black people and Black Americans going back in the 30s and the 20s and 30s and the early part of the 20th century, a lot of them still knew that they was Indians. A lot of them still knew they was Indians. A lot of them still knew that they were connected to Indian tribes. And there's one thing why our people didn't talk about it more, but our grandmothers, grandfathers, and other people, they'll tell you, oh, we Indian. We not African. We Indian. We come from this tribe, that tribe. So if Elijah Muhammad and them, they go back, he was born 1897, just like my grandfather, he was born 1899, 2 years after Elijah Muhammad. They knew that they had that they were Indians. My grandfather, they knew they was Indians. But see, they didn't talk about that because, back then, the U.S. government and a lot of these law enforcement agencies were hunting bronze people, so-called black people. They were hunting. In other words, if you were going around claiming, speaking the truth that you were American Indian, then they would kill you. They would threaten our people not to use the term Indian. Just like today, they threaten a lot of these entertainers like your Waka Flockas and Snoop Dogg and even Pharrell Williams. They're threatened by their handlers not to call themselves American Indian, because there was a rumor that was going around that they wanted to start referring to themselves as American Indians, not African Americans. And that movement was stopped because their handlers who, control their purse strings tell them they don't want them influencing, because that's the real thing. They don't want these celebrities influencing other so-called black Americans to start referring to themselves as American Indian. You see, and not African American. You see, they don't want that. The U.S. government don't want that. They don't want black Americans to disassociate with African American, which is a false title, because, we didn't immigrate over into America. American, so-called black Americans was always here in America, always. From South America, black Americans are native to the American continents, South and Central America. We are native to those continents and all of the landmass in between. We're native to this place. Indigenous. I had to change that up. We are indigenous to the American continents of South America and Central America. And everybody else that's there came from elsewhere on the other side. They came from either Africa, Europe, or Asia. We are the only ones who are indigenous to the American continents of South and Central America. You see, but we're taught, history talking that we came from Africa, and that every place we are on earth had to do with, we was African slaves. That's an insult to the intelligence of our people to think that we didn't circumnavigate, go around the world and go to these different places and leave our American culture. Because like I said before, ancient Egyptian culture is American culture. Ancient Egyptian culture is American culture, because you have more pyramids in the Americas than you have in Egypt. American culture has always dominated the planet. Even ancient American culture has always dominated the planet. You see, America is only new to the Europeans. America is only new to Europeans and the Asians after a while. But America has always been our home. So no, black Americans have no connection to Africans at all. At all. Even to this day, you can look and see the culture is different. Because if we were truly connected to Africans, there would be more of a, more of a kinship. You see, there'll be more of a kinship. There'd be more of a connection. But you can clearly see there is no real kinship amongst black Americans and Africans of the diaspora, the people over in the continent. There's really no connection with that at all. Our culture, everything is different. They can't explain how it is that we produce this kind of music over here, the music we produce, the foods we eat. They can't, your historians and all these so-called historians, they can't explain how that happened. Like I said with Tariq Nasheed, he keeps on talking about this ethnogenesis. I call that again, I'm just talking about the theory. That's nothing but a theory. That's a theory. Because Tariq Nasheed, he said so-called black Americans are the product of an ethnogenesis of Africans, slaves, and the indigenous people mixing in. But again, I proved how ridiculous that is. But then he'll say we're not African. How are we not African if you're saying we are the product of Africans and American indigenous people mixing, but we're not African? That makes zero sense. We just became you don't know, you can't delineate, or not delineate, what's the word he used? You can't have an ethnogenesis from the root that you came from. You can't. But then they'll use the argument that all life started in Africa. Let me explain something to you. All that ethnogenesis nonsense and all that all life started in Africa is nothing but European or Caucasian theories about life. And a lot of stuff they say don't make sense. And you got a lot of so-called black people who follow because they're looking at these people and their academic accreditation that they give themselves, these stances they take on history. Because people, when people make assertions and put out theories and, they stand on podiums and they have DRs in front of their name and PhD. Y'all tend to believe these people. These people gave their own self accreditation and authority over the truth, over history. They make up stuff all the time. You see that even that term ethnogenesis, that comes from Caucasians, man. That comes from a belief. Caucasians, that's nothing but a Caucasian theory, man, that Tariq Nasheed copied. That ethnogenesis nonsense. They take terms and attach that to our people that don't even make sense. How you gonna say we're not African, but then you say we the product of Africans and American Indians mixing to make this so-called new black culture? Don't y'all teach there ain't nothing new under the sun? If there's nothing new under the sun, then there's no ethnogenesis. There's nothing new coming out of that. That was something that obviously didn't come from Africa. The music and things like that we produced and created, it didn't come out of Africa because you would hear the Africans on the same rhythm as us. So obviously that came from a culture and a history that people don't want to talk about. The rhythm, the drum, the dancing and stuff like that. That comes from a whole culture that is independent of Africa. And that is American Indian culture, American Indigenous culture. Our music, our food, everything is American. It's American Indigenous. From when we were from Mesoamericans, from the Mayans, the Aztec, the Inca people, all of that, Olmec, all of the dancing and sports and all this other stuff and foods and things like that, instruments and music, all that comes from our American Indigenous heritage, not from Africa. That's not African. We're not African. But you got people who are trying to Africanize us and the reason why you got a lot of these people who are trying to Africanize us, like again, no disrespect, but Tariq Nasheed on the low is trying to Africanize us. Because if you're saying that we are the product of Africans and American Indigenous people, American Indians, bronze skinned people mixing, and we're the product of that, then you Africanizing us. What's wrong with just saying the truth that we have no African in us? Because if you're going to say we're not African, that means we're not African. That means we're not part of it. Because he at one point in time said that a very small percentage of Africans made it into America. Like 3%. I don't know where they get these numbers from. I think it'd be lower than that because it would make no sense for Africans to be here. If you look back at a lot of those those so-called manifests on the boats that they call ships, they was trading Black Americans who were in the Americas back and forth. They were trading our people for labor and for work back and forth. A lot of our people signed on to do work for labor, for money and things and a place in America. So a lot of people signed on for that. But American Indigenous people, the slave trade and the labor was always here in the Americas, not in Africa, not no other place. Because what good would it do? What good would it do to bring people into this country who can't speak the language and can't really do anything, that you would have to get to understand the language and beat them and do all this other stuff to make them do stuff, and they don't understand you? What good would that do? What sense would that make? Wouldn't you take the people that are already here doing this stuff and enslave them? The people that were already doing building and growing on the land. See, because they don't want to tell the truth that the reason why black American so-called slaves, the only reason they would be valuable is if they had skills. The Africans had no skills. You see, it's the same way the so-called Native Americans had no skill, because they always like to brag about so-called Native Americans always like to brag about how they were never enslaved. And like I said, the only reason they were never enslaved is because they didn't know how to do anything. The people that were enslaved were the people who were skilled people. We were the skilled people. We were the skilled labor. We knew how to build. We knew how to grow food. We knew how to harvest food. We were valuable people. Those are the people that were enslaved. Black Americans, who are aka American Indians, were enslaved. Not to be confused with the Native Americans, the Mongolian looking people. They were just basically squatting on the land, and they didn't really know how to, they didn't really have any skills. They never argued the fact that they were squatting on the land and setting up teepees and whatnot. Those are squatters. Like you see today in tent cities. They were tent city squatters. That's what your Native Americans was. But that's it. I'm going to close this message out. In the name of Amen, by the power of Amen. Amen we trust, and Amen we thank, and Amen we continue forward forever.